This is United States History 201, Presentation 7, End to Salutary Neglect and Prelude to Independence. So in our last presentation, we looked at some of the things going on in colonial culture, the mind of the colonial culture, and of course the end of that presentation was also the French and Indian War, which I mentioned would lead to the American War for Independence. And so essentially that's what I'm going to do here. Talk about how that war did lead to the American War for Independence. And then the next presentation we'll talk about the war itself, and then the last two presentations for this section we'll talk about the Articles of Confederation, and then the last presentation, the Constitution. So, salutary neglect. What does that mean? Well, salutary means beneficial. So essentially what was happening from the time the colonies were founded in the early 17th century until right after the French and Indian War, right about that time, the colonies were generally left alone. Of course, we talked about the British trade policies and how they were generally ignored in colonial America, and the colonies were allowed to do many things. They were allowed to print their own money. Their taxing policies and things of that nature were often up to them. And so these things had to be approved by the Crown oftentimes. But what you had working in a constitutional framework was the Parliament in London was supreme, but it didn't function as a national guide, or at least a hands-on guide to the colonies. So it was very much like, at least in the colonial perspective, a federal system, where you had the colonies setting their own agenda in terms of domestic policy, and then the Crown regulated international trade and, of course, defense. And if you look at the United States Constitution, that's essentially what happens there. So we get that kind of system back through the United States Constitution. And it was basically like that under the Articles of Confederation too, but a little weaker. So that's how the Americans conceptualize of the British Empire. Not just, actually, I must say, not just in British North America, but also in the other British colonies, in the Caribbean as well. This is how they viewed the situation, even after, in the 1760s moving forward. This is how they talked about it. Well, yeah, Parliament can regulate trade, but it cannot tax us directly. It cannot set our internal policies. It can determine war, but there's even some limitations on that. So you had these colonies operating very much autonomously, and then when the British come in and say, guess what, you're going to do what we say, put our thumb on you, that's going to cause some problems. So colonial outrage against unconstitutional policies by the Crown and Parliament reach a boiling point in this period, eventually spilling over to war. And there's a number of issues here: taxing, quartering of troops, trade policy, suppression of free government, violation of English liberties. These were the things that were talked about. Parliament believes the colonies should help foot the bill for the upkeep of the army and the debt incurred during the French and Indian War. They said, after all, we fought the war primarily in North America. You should pay for it. Now, British subjects in England itself were paying higher taxes than they were in the colonies, but that's irrelevant. Now, the first law for raising revenue exclusively in the colonies was passed in 1764. It was called the American Revenue Act, also called the Sugar Act. This increased the tax on sugar, coffee, textiles, indigo, and wines. It banned French wines and foreign rum. And this is the first time the British had done this in a long time. So this really ended salutary neglect, or the beneficial neglect of the colonies. And a constitutional crisis begins here, as I just mentioned. There's a debate. Well, can Parliament even do this? Can they increase the tax on these goods? We're supposed to set our own internal taxing policy, and this is where colonists started to push back a little bit. 1765 was also an important year because the Parliament will pass a number of pieces of legislation dealing exclusively with the colonies in so many ways. But the Currency Act of 1765 prohibited the colonies from printing their own money, called colonial scrip. This would help lead to a depression because you had the loss of currency. They had to use the British pound, and they couldn't have their own money, and so there's a point of deflation. The Quartering Act of 1765 required the colonies to furnish barracks and supplies for British troops. They could be quartered in inns, alehouses, and unoccupied buildings, not homes, but of course the colonists had to pay for this stuff. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the first direct tax on the colonies. It was a tax on all paper products, newspapers, almanacs, legal documents, playing cards. Every paper item had to have the tax. This, in many ways, was an ex post facto law, meaning that it backed up. So even if laws passed on a certain date, so anything that hadn't been stamped even before that date had to be stamped. So if you had a home full of books, theoretically you had to have all those books taxed at that point. So it's an ex post facto law. And what the Parliament started doing were passing things called writs of assistance. And the writs of assistance were used in the colonies. Basically, the soldiers could write out their own writs. So they could come in and say, look, we believe you have paper products in your house. We're going to write ourselves the ability to walk into your house and look around. And they could tax, and of course, if you didn't have your paper products properly taxed, they could throw you in jail for this. So this was highly egregious, and people were infuriated about the Stamp Act more than anything else. So there was immediate opposition in all 13 colonies. In fact, the phrase "no taxation without representation" became very popular here. Colonial leaders believed Parliament was deliberately and unconstitutionally trying to weaken them, and the colonies in general. And there was some violence against tax collectors and those who supported the law. In fact, the Sons of Liberty, which often used violence, was formed in this period of time, and the colonists would adopt something called non-importation. We're not going to import any British goods. We're going to hit you in the wallet, so we don't have to deal with these type of egregious laws anymore. And that actually works. It works over and over again. And so keep that in mind as we move forward, because when we get into Unit 3 material, we'll talk about non-importation again. Jefferson and Madison actually dust that off at one point to harm the British. It's also in this particular year that in Virginia, Patrick Henry, he was a newly elected member of the House of Burgesses there in Virginia, very young man, is going to offer something called the Virginia Resolves. Henry's resolves called the taxes unconstitutional, the violation of English liberties, and the colonial charters. And essentially, he said in these resolves that Virginia could act independently when the Parliament violated the rights of Englishmen. So he's already saying, he's 10 years before an open break or independence is even really discussed in a lot of detail. He's already saying we can do this. So Henry was really on the cutting edge of the situation in the British North American colonies. And he presented these things when most of the Burgesses were out. In fact, in his speech, he alluded to the potential assassination of George III, which received an immediate rebuke. But Henry's on the verge, on the cutting edge on the vanguard, so to speak, of public opinion here, and really trying to lead it along in a certain direction. 1765, you have the Stamp Act Congress. 9 colonies will meet to discuss action against the Parliament and the Stamp Act. These colonies were Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and South Carolina. And there were a number of important participants, people like James Otis Jr. of Massachusetts, John Dickinson of Delaware, John Adams of Massachusetts, Caesar Rodney of Delaware, and Robert Livingston of New York. What they came up with was something called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. This said the Parliament was abusing its power. Only colonial legislatures could tax the colonies. And so this was a step in saying, look, in that federal type vision they had of the Constitution, the English Constitution, we are the only ones, because we're the closest to the location of power. We don't have any representation in Parliament, so only we can set these policies. You can't. And so here we have 1765, 11 years before the Declaration of Independence, or these states started declaring their independence at that point. But 10 years before the war begins, you're already seeing some problems developing. Now, because of non-importation, the British will repeal the Stamp Act in 1766 due to the economic pressure of non-importation. Now, this gives me a chance to talk about really 3 distinct groups that are in the colonies at the time. On one hand, you had the Tories or the Loyalists. They were people like William Franklin of New Jersey. He was the illegitimate son of Benjamin Franklin, but the royal governor of New Jersey. And a Loyalist was a person who opposed all colonial agitation and action against the Parliament and Crown. They basically said, look, the Parliament is supreme. Whatever they say goes. You rabble-rousers out there are just causing problems. And they would never support independence. In fact, William Franklin will sail back to England when the war begins. His son will stay here and support the Patriot cause, as will his father, Benjamin Franklin. So this war really splits the family apart. 1/4 of the colonial population was probably in the Tory or Loyalist camp. I mean, it's impossible to know the exact numbers, but it's probably somewhere around there. Then you had people like John Dickinson of Delaware, Pennsylvania. These moderates. Dickinson is one of the most important men in the founding generation, but he's often forgotten. He took part in every significant event from the Stamp Act Congress to the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. But he was a moderate. He did support colonial grievances. He did say that the colonies, the British were abusing the rights of Englishmen. In fact, he was called the penman of the Revolution because of his very famous treatise, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. But he was initially against independence, not because he didn't think it was going to happen. In fact, he knew this was going to happen, but because he thought the time wasn't right. He didn't think the United States stood a chance against the British in 1776, so he did not sign the Declaration of Independence, though the day that it was adopted and signed, he joined the army to defend the colonies against, or at that point, the states against the British. And this was this moderate position. Well, we know that the Parliament's abusing their powers, but we're not ready to break with the Crown. At one point, this was probably about half of the population. And that's generally the way it is. People are, they can see both sides. They can see, well, yeah, we're being abused, but I don't know if we need to go so far as to declare our independence. We still like, to be part of the British Empire, et cetera, et cetera. But Dickinson knew full well what was going to happen. He was a Quaker. In fact, all of his property is going to be burned during the war, except for his plantation in Dover, Delaware, which is still there. So Dickinson suffered a financial setback. His reputation was damaged by the fact that he did not agree to sign the Declaration, that he would have voted against it, though Pennsylvania voted for it when he didn't show up on the day of the voting. So that was by design. But Dickinson is a very important guy, often overlooked, and unfortunately overlooked. And then last but not least, you had the Patriots, people like Sam Adams of Massachusetts, very famous agitator, great orator and writer, but not very good with money. In fact, he was really reckless. The only reason he stayed afloat financially is because his wife was able to keep them afloat. And she was a spendthrift, and Adams had a business that he ruined. He born with a silver spoon, inherited all kinds of stuff from his father. He ruined all that. One of the founder of the Sons of Liberty, and he took part in virtually every action against the Crown leading to independence, including support for violence at points. So Adams was kind of on, along with Patrick Henry and some others, was kind of on this vanguard saying, well, we need to do something now. Even when nothing was going on, Adams said independence should be our primary goal. This is about 1/4 of the population as well. So you had those who were opposed to everything that the American colonists were saying were grievances. You had 75% that thought, yeah, we have some legitimate grievances here. But then only that 75%, maybe 1 in 4, or a total population would say, well, we need independence at this point. At this point in the process. Now, so you had the Stamp Act Congress. The Stamp Act's repealed in 1766, but Charles Townshend becomes the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And in 1767, something called the Townshend Acts are passed. These were taxes on lead, glass, paper, and tea. Townshend said that these would defray the costs of government and reaffirm parliamentary authority over the colonies. And basically, this codified support for the writs of assistance, though they were never used at that point. But what the Parliament was saying here is that there is virtual representation. Well, we virtually represent you. You don't have to have physical bodies here. We represent you because you're part of the empire. Even though they look down their nose at the colonials, they really didn't care for these people in the British North American colonies. But Townshend would actually die very shortly after this. And the Townshend Acts, though, would be, again, violently resisted in the colonies. 1768, Massachusetts would take action against the Townshend Acts. In 1768, you had a circular letter written by Samuel Adams, which denounced the Townshend Acts, and because of that, the General Court, which was their legislature, was dissolved. It's also in 1768 that John Hancock's ship, the Liberty, was seized. Now, Hancock, pictured here, was a smuggler, and he didn't pay as much taxes as the British thought he should pay. He was a very wealthy man. In fact, the wealthiest man, if not in Massachusetts, not all the colonies at this point. But troops would arrive in Boston now. 1768 becomes a really important year because it's a powder keg ready to explode. It takes a little time, but troops are sent in. The Parliament is saying that the Bostonians are being a little bit, in their mind, obnoxious, and they think that they need to shut down government and show force here to keep these Massachusetts in line. Well, in 1769, it's apparent that it's not just Massachusetts that opposes these things, because in 1769 you have another set of Virginia resolves written by George Washington and George Mason, which denounced Parliament. They said taxing was the right of the colonies alone, and because of that, the royal governor, the Baron de Botetourt, dissolved the House of Burgesses. So here you have the Massachusetts General Court dissolved. You have the House of Burgesses dissolved in Virginia. This is really problematic, and this is the suppression of free government. And so what happens there is very interesting. All these guys in Virginia are just going to get up, they're going to leave, and they're going to go down the street to the Raleigh Tavern, where they have meetings there. And they pass something called the Virginia Association, which was a non-importation of British goods. mainly luxury items, including slaves. And eventually this will spread south. In fact, non-importation becomes very effective, and the British reconsider their trade policies, and by 1770, the townshend duties were limited to tea alone. But this is why Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence that legislative power is incapable of annihilation, because he's saying there that even if you dissolve our legislature, the people still have all the power, and those legislators, no matter where they're meeting, the government cannot say you're dissolved. They can just go meet somewhere else and still pass legislation. And because the people support it, because they have legitimacy, that means that government is in effect no matter what the ruling power says. Now, 1770 is important here because you have riots in New York City over the Quartering Act, and then you have the Boston Massacre in front of the old State House, which is pictured here behind in this image. This building is still there in Boston, the old State House. Now, this is called a massacre, but you think massacre, thousands of people killed, hundreds of people killed, whatever it is. There are only 5 deaths and 6 people wounded. In fact, the first killed was a runaway slave named Crispus Attucks. But this is a very controversial event. In fact, Paul Revere, who made this image, is using this as propaganda. So here we have these Boston troops firing on a crowd, killing people. But the question is, were the troops justified? This is a major event of controversy because the soldiers swore that they never gave the order to fire, particularly Captain Thomas Preston, who was in charge of these men. But what happened? It was a very cold day. These soldiers had been harassed all day. People were throwing stuff at them and calling them lobster backs and all kinds of things. And so the soldiers would file out of their barracks and tell these people to disperse. They wouldn't. And then there was a fire in Boston, and some people believe that the call for the fire department was what these guys heard, and they fired. There's also a speculation that Sam Adams was standing in the shadows saying, "Fire!" and which is why these guys fired. They all knew that this could cause irreparable damage to the British. Now, John Adams actually was the lead defense attorney for the soldiers, and he had Captain Thomas Preston acquitted. He had 2 people eventually were charged with manslaughter with reduced sentences, which was branding of the thumb, and 4 civilians were acquitted with starting a riot. 1 servant was charged, sentenced to whipping and banishment. And on the other hand, the people that started this riot, one of them, the servant, was punished for this. So this is a very controversial event, and John Adams was well aware that if he defended these soldiers, that could harm his reputation, and it did for a time. But he wanted to ensure that the British soldiers got a fair trial, because if they didn't, then Boston could face even more problems. So 2 years, nothing happens, or not much happens. Sam Adams would organize a new committee of correspondence, which was, the idea was to communicate with the world, not just the British North American colonies, but with all the world. And so it expands to all the colonies. This is the 18th century internet. People have said before, well, the founders wouldn't understand the issues of privacy and other things in the 21st century because they didn't have the internet and modern technology. Well, that's true, but they understood the value of information, and they understood the value of privacy. And so you can look at these issues within that context and say, yeah, I'm sure they would have been all for the internet. It would have helped them organize things, but they also would have been suspicious of who could look and spy in on what you're doing, and because they were very secretive in that way. So they wanted to ensure the British couldn't read all their papers and everything they were doing at all times. So they would have been concerned with an overpowerful police state that can watch everything you're doing at all times. Now, 1773, the Parliament will pass something called the Tea Act. This is a very small tax on tea that guaranteed the monopoly on the tea trade by the British East India Company. That was the real grievance here. Not that there was a tax on tea, but that there was a monopoly, and only certain people could sell this tea. So all the other merchants in Boston were going to go bankrupt if they were selling tea. So what happens is the first ship carrying this untaxed tea shows up in the Boston Harbor. This was tea that wasn't taxed. So the British East India tea was not taxed. So the people that could sell that tea were going to make lots of money. So when the very first shipment of this untaxed tea shows up in Boston Harbor on the Dartmouth, the people of Boston say, you can't dock. We're not going to let you, unless you pay the tax, you can't dock here. Well, the captain of the ship says, well, I'm not going to pay the tax. I don't have to. So the Sons of Liberty were organized, and they'll dress as Mohawk Indians, and at a given signal by Sam Adams, they file out of their meeting place, and they hop on these ships, and the Boston Tea Party begins. They throw all this tea overboard, and this becomes a very important event, of course, in the aggression to the American War for Independence. But the Bostonians were actually stupid in this regard because the people in the South did it right. In Charleston, they seized the tea and then sold it and used the money to pay for their anti-British activities. In Annapolis, the same thing happened. They seized the tea, brought it off the ship, and then sold it as well. They did burn the ship in Annapolis, though, but much more dramatic. But the Bostonians wasted all this money. They could have used this stuff. Now, 1774 is an important year because of all the legislation that's passed. You have the Coercive or Untitled Acts of 1774, which include the Boston Port Bill. The Port of Boston is shut down, except to military items. The Administration of Justice Act. The government of Massachusetts the Administration of Justice Act dusted off an old medieval law that if you're arrested, you had to be tried back over in London for any crimes. The Massachusetts Government Act, which shut down the government of Massachusetts. The Courting Act was expanded to not only include unoccupied buildings, alehouses, and places like that, but also private homes. The Quebec Act was passed, which basically put Massachusetts under the government of Quebec, which was seen as an affront to Massachusetts. So as a result, the First Continental Congress will meet at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. This is now Independence Hall. And they're going to pass a series of resolves known as the Suffolk Resolves and the Declaration and Resolves. The Suffolk Resolve said that coercive acts were unconstitutional and not to be obeyed. This is essentially what we call nullification today. The coercive acts are unconstitutional and not to be obeyed. Because they're unconstitutional, people should not obey them. And the colonial governments would not obey them. They also said they would, the Suffolk Resolves withhold taxes from Parliament because of this activity. And they were going to form militias, and they were going to force stringent economic sanctions against the British. The Declaration and Resolves echoed the Suffolk Resolves. They were more stringent in the defense of the rights of Englishmen in the ancient constitutions of their ancestors. But again, here are the colonies saying, guess what? We're going to assert our authority, our sovereignty, and we're going to say no to your unconstitutional legislation. At the same time, the Committee of Public Safety was organized in Massachusetts by John Hancock. Hancock's an interesting guy. Again, the wealthiest guy in the colonies, perhaps. This would be like Bill Gates shutting down all of his businesses and putting all of his money into some particular political cause, which is exactly what Hancock was doing. In fact, the Adams called him the milk cow of the revolution. And these people were called Minutemen. They were militia. They're ready at a minute's notice. They also adopted something called the Continental Association, which was non-importation. And the idea was to not import British goods. Now, the Dominion theory is very important because this is floated around at the time. What this said was that the colonies were only subject to King George III, not Parliament. And that's because each colony was a realm, meaning that these realms were granted by the king. And so only George III could rule for the colonies, and basically by default his governors through him. But the Parliament couldn't legislate for the colonies. Only George III could. And this idea was floated around for a time. So at one point, the colonies are going to appeal directly to the king and say, look, king, you can stop this stuff. We're part of your realm. We're part of your domain. And each of these colonies are kind of like an independent realm. But you can stop this stuff. We'll only listen to you. You just tell us. We'll stick with you. We'll forget about this Parliament over there because it's being obnoxious. But, of course, George III wouldn't do so. Now, Patrick Henry, on March 23rd, 1775, will give a very famous speech at St. John's Church in Richmond entitled The Illusion of Hope. We know it better as Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death. And that's because the Virginia legislature was suspended by Lord Dunmore at this point. At this point, Henry says, look, we have no chance here. The only thing we can do is fight, and why aren't we fighting? And he says, there's very famous things in this speech. Is life so dear, a peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Should we go through that? But he did say that people are naturally to indulge in the illusion of hope. They're apt to shut their eyes against the painful truth until that siren will lead them to ruin. And I'm paraphrasing some of this, but should we just hug this phantom of hope and just please stop? He's saying now is the time to fight, and we have to do it. And he's prophetic because the war will begin in just a couple of weeks. In fact, Old North Church was the viewing point for the Bostonians, and they had a signal, one if by land, two if by sea. The British were given orders to invade Boston marched to Concord and disarmed the colonists on April 18th, 1775, which again is only about 3 weeks actually after Henry gave the speech. The war began at that point. This is the Battle of Lexington and Concord. At that point, Paul Revere and William Dawes, along with perhaps 40 other men, were right out to the countryside yelling, "The regulars are coming out!" And so, not the British are coming, because they're all British. But the regulars are coming out. And so this is when the Minutemen would get up, kiss their families, take their musket off the mantle, and go fight the British, which is an amazing act of heroism. This is perhaps the best army in the world, and these guys are willing to go out and fight them. So Lexington and Concord took place on April 18th in 1775. Captain John Parker and about 80 men showed up at Lexington in the morning, and Parker gave the following order: "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have war, let it begin here." And what happened was the British show up at Lexington. They tell the men to disperse. They do, but don't drop their weapons, and so shots are fired. This kicks the hornet's nest. From that point forward, Americans are coming out of everywhere to attack the British. And at these battles, by the time the British get back to Boston, they've lost 276 men out of 700. There are only 89 American casualties. But at this point, Americans believe they can win the war, but the war has actually begun at this point. And we'll talk about the war in the next presentation.